Prime Minister once said to me, "Wow, Mark, it sounds like your life has been one big disaster." I said, "Prime Minister, if only you knew." He was responding to the briefing I'd just given him about my career background when I first met him. My response was about the personal adversities in my private life, which I didn't brief him on, which the world couldn't see. See, in my mid-30s particularly, I went through mental health challenges, particularly clinical depression, divorce, loss of assets and family home, incurable cancer diagnosis, and unexpected career changes, all in my mid to late 30s, some simultaneously, some in quick succession. At the same time, I was trying to raise a young family of 3 young children as a part-time single parent and sustain a career to keep the family together. Really, really difficult times, and some of you might be able to relate to some of that stuff, and particularly Liz, of course. I remember waking up at 3 o'clock one morning, just outraged and incensed at how much suffering I was having to navigate. And I yelled at the universe. I said, "What on earth is all this about? Why do I have to suffer so much?" And I demanded an answer. And of course, what I got back was profound silence. I got no response. But profound silence was actually what I needed, because 3 existential propositions turned up. And one is, what if life happens for us, not to us? What if suffering has a function? What if adversity is a teacher? And those 3 propositions have been with me for the last 25 years and have helped to shape and guide my life privately and personally and professionally. And they've never left my side. I came to realise that adversity is the greatest teacher of virtue, and the greatest virtue is to be compassionate to self and to other. And little did I know how important that insight would be then in my late 50s when the greatest adversity of my life would turn up. But more about that in a minute. Of course, Canberrans are no stranger to adversity. The 18th of January 2003 records the deaths of 4 people and 488 homes destroyed in a single afternoon from Canberra's worst bushfire in its European history. At that stage, I was an Assistant Commissioner of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, and I was rung by the Commissioner that morning and asked to attend Canberra to see if I could convince the local authorities to take more resource. So I responded to Canberra. I was coming down the Federal Highway, approaching Northbourne Avenue, and I looked to the southwest and I saw the biggest column of smoke and fire I'd seen in my then 20-odd year career. And I thought, wow, today's going to be a bad day. I got to Curtin, walked into the operations centre, and one of the leaders in charge on the day walked up to me and said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, the Commissioner's told me to come down and see if I can offer further assistance and more resource." And he said, "Well, I've already told you, Commissioner, we don't need any further assistance, thanks very much." And I said, "Be that as it may, would you mind giving me a brief?" So he was kind enough to do that. And he gave me a brief, and we talked strategy and tactic, and we had polar opposite views about what we thought would happen. He thought Canberra would be largely okay, and he had sufficient resource to deal with whatever happened, and I thought the exact opposite. I couldn't convince him to change his mind, and he walked off. He walked out of the operations room and said he had other things to take care of, and left me high and dry. I stepped out of that operations centre, went white as a ghost, felt cold and clammy, and nearly threw up. Why, you might ask? Because I doubted myself. I thought, have I got this wrong after 20-odd years in the fire service, everything I'd been through, everything I'd seen, everything I'd analysed? Then it dawned on me that I didn't get it wrong. I wasn't getting it wrong, he was. And it wasn't a moral judgment. I didn't make him wrong. He was a good person. But his decision-making process was flawed. And I thought, well, what do I do now? I've got no resources, authority, resource or permission. Under law, I cannot act as a uniformed officer. Without those things, I can't move. But morally, I thought I have to do something. So I went across to Queanbeyan, where I did have jurisdiction and authority, and I directed the local superintendent to release his task forces into Canberra immediately and offer whatever assistance they could. That day taught me 2 really important lessons. One is how much courage it takes to face adversity and be compassionate. See, sometimes the world can't see what we can see. Sometimes we can see suffering and the world can't see it. And that can be very personal, it can be very overt. Sometimes the world can see it, sometimes the world can't, however you perceive the world. So it took a lot of courage to step into that adverse space, and I've carried that with me for the rest of my life as well. But I learned something else about the sector, and that was that it had 2 things operating within its culture: defiance and overconfidence. And at the time I thought about this, and I thought, is this just unique to Canberra, or is this more systematic? I didn't know the answer to that, so I continued into my career, and little did I know I was about to find out some 5 years later. I went to the Victorian fires in 2009. I find defiance and overconfidence in the system. I go to the Brisbane floods in 2010. I find the same attributes. I go to Cyclone Yasi in 2011, and they turn up yet again. And then I go to the Lismore floods in 2017, and lo and behold, they're still there. And this really worried me, it really bothered me, because it was putting a wedge between leaders and citizens, and trust was being breached in pretty much every operation on some level. I was so concerned about it, I thought I'm going to do a PhD, as you do, why not? Nothing better to do at the time than do a PhD after being a Commissioner and Director General and everything else. And I looked I gathered evidence from 3 major inquiries, so 2 major inquiries from Australia and 1 from the US. And I was looking particularly at the witness statements of the citizens as they gave their evidence. And then I interviewed 89 leaders across 3 countries, the United States, Australia and New Zealand. And what I found was 2 really strikingly different but profound stories in the data. One was a tragic story, one was an inspirational story. The tragic story was one of invulnerability. When leaders were invulnerable, when they failed to adequately see, sense and feel the suffering of themselves, they failed to see, sense and feel the suffering of others. That led to this insensitivity. And when they were insensitive to suffering, when they couldn't see it or chose not to see it because they denied, disavowed or ignored it, it flourished unabated. That made their responses insufficient. So it didn't matter what they did, the response was actually insufficient. They tended to hide behind regimes of compliance, so they hid behind their policies and frameworks and legislation and standards in order to feel safe and justified. And then they got very defensive when criticised, particularly by the media and by the inquiry process. And that would spin round in a circle. And it would pervade culture very unconsciously, not intentionally, and it didn't make people bad. They weren't bad people, but it did make them lesser. It did make them less happy because they were defensive and on the back foot and couldn't connect. I remember one witness statement of a young mother and 3 young children who caught on the roof of a house in 12 metres of floodwater. And she had followed the resilience advice of the government and she'd listened out for warnings on the day, but they didn't come. And emergency services turned up to rescue her. And the first thing they said was, "What are you doing here? You should have evacuated. In fact, you shouldn't even be living here." And she said in her witness statement how dehumanised she felt, how morally judged she felt, because she had actually followed the advice. She had listened for warnings, but they didn't come because even emergency services didn't warn properly. And she walked away from that lived experience quite devastated, quite upset. But there's another story that comes out of the data which is far more inspiring, and that is one of relationality. When we can see, sense and feel our own suffering, and we can see, sense and feel the suffering of others, we establish a relationship, we establish our relatability. When we're relatable, we tend to be more committed to doing something about that suffering we can now see, sense or feel. We often have to be venturous about how we do that, so we have to step in the face of great adversity and take great personal risk, much like what I had to do in Canberra in 2003. And we're still accountable for action. So our actions of body, speech and mind, we're still accountable for those and accountable for outcomes, and we can't walk away from that. There were 2 leaders that really impressed me with this style of leadership, and it was exemplified across men and women, across the 90 leaders that I interviewed, and it was much more common than this tragic story, which is obviously good to know. And one I'll call David, and the other I'll call Peter. David was a US governor of a state of over 20 million people, and he was asked to attend a public meeting one evening of parents who had children with severe disability. And they weren't happy with the policy settings of the state because the kids would become wards of the state upon the death of the parents. And so he went to the meeting, and one parent particularly was very vocal in opposition to his policies. And he said, "Look, I don't know what it's like to have a child with disability. I don't have that circumstance in my life, but I want to learn." So he said, "How about we do this? How about I give you 5 days of my time and you can spend it any way you like?" And so she agreed, and he did. And he lived with her for 5 days to understand. He was so profoundly moved by the experience that he came back and changed the legislation and the policy settings, much to the satisfaction of the parents, and eased their anxiety about their children. Peter was an Attorney General and Prisons Minister in an Australian government. He had a young female prisoner who was pregnant and due to surrender the child to foster care upon birth. And she lobbied him intensely because she was so depressed at the proposition of losing her child. He didn't fully understand the circumstance, but he wanted to know more, so he went into the prison and sat next to her and said, "Tell me your story." She told a story of child sexual abuse, alcoholism, drug dependency. We all know the stories, how sad they are and how common they are. He was so profoundly moved, he came back, he changed the legislation. He said to the Director General of the department, "Let her keep the child in prison, set up a creche and make it happen." What these two leaders exemplified is a couple of things. First of all, they had the capacity to see suffering, to step up, step in and run towards it and use their privilege to do something about it. They were immensely privileged people, but they could see, sense and feel suffering and they were prepared to actually act on it. The other thing is that they made the distinction between circumstance and experience. See, David didn't have the circumstances of a disabled child, but he did have the circumstance of a child with drug dependency, and he understood anxiety, he understood the experience. Peter didn't have a daughter in prison with an unborn child, but he did understand depression, because he'd had depression early in his career. And so neither could understand experience, neither could understand circumstance, but they could certainly understand experience. And if we think about it, if we jump on that slippery slope of circumstance and we slide towards zero, so in other words, we can't relate. So if we only try and relate through circumstance, we slide towards zero. We probably can't relate. We run the risk of being invulnerable and insensitive, but more importantly, we run the risk of being unhappy. Because when we're relational, when we jump back on the scale of relatability through experience, we slide towards one, because we all share the experience of sadness, loss, suffering, but also happiness and joy. And that's where we find our happiness. This was never more profound for me, this dichotomy and this paradox, than when my dear wife passed away 18 months ago, suddenly, tragically, and without warning. And people would say to me, Mark, I can't possibly understand how you must be feeling. And I'd let them talk, and I realised that they could. They didn't have the circumstances of losing a partner, a wife, a spouse or a husband, but they had lost someone they loved. They'd had that experience. And it was through that experience and that conversation of experience that helped me with my grief, helped me to navigate the sadness, the complexity, how to get back on my feet, how to live life again. And that's an ongoing process, and those conversations continue pretty much every day. So there's three things I want to leave you with. The first one is adversity teaches virtue. And the greatest virtue is to be compassionate to self and to other. The second thing is that suffering has a function, and suffering should be honoured. We shouldn't run away from our suffering, we should honour it. When we honour it, we get the chance to do something about it, to ourselves and for others. When we deny, disavow or ignore it, when we run away from it, we allow it to flourish unabated. And finally, we may not be able to always relate to circumstance, but we can always relate to experience. Have the courage to be relational. Have the courage to be compassionate. It's where you'll find your happiness, and God only knows the world needs it right now. Thanks very much.